The topic is components of Linux machine, its architecture and its layers. Also, what are Linux distros or Linux distributions or flavors? Architecture or components of Linux machine includes the core, that is the hardware, then kernel, then shell, then applications or utilities. So you can think of it as Linux machine is like a restaurant, the hardware is the building and the kitchen, while the operating system is the staff and the menu that make everything work together. That is the four main layers of Linux machine. The Linux architecture is designed like a series of protective rings. Each ring relies on the one inside it to work. So the first component would be the hardware, the core. This is the physical body of your computer. What it is? The CPU, brain, RAM, memory, hard drive, storage, and the motherboard. So the hardware simply is the hardware, physical device or your laptop or a device or a computer. Something that is physical called the hardware or the motherboard, CPU. All this comes under the hardware layer in a Linux machine. And the second would be the kernel or the brain. So we must know this fact that you as a human or any person could not communicate with the hardware itself. In order for the hardware to understand your language or a communication, or there is something known as the kernel. Kernel is like the brain that lets the hardware understand the commands or the instructions which we are giving. Linux commands or distributions through the brain. That brain is the kernel. Kernel helps hardware communicate with humans or humans to communicate with the hardware. So what it is? The kernel is the most important part of the operating system. It lives right above the hardware. It is a specialized piece of software that talks directly to the hardware. It manages memory and tells the CPU which tasks to work on next. It is like the head chef. You don't talk to the chef directly, but they control everything in the kitchen, make sure the equipment is being used correctly. So the third would be the shell, the translator. The shell is the layer that wraps around the kernel to make it usable for humans. It is an interface that takes your commands like open this file and translates them into language kernel can understand. So in simplified, it is like a waiter you give the order to. So the shell is like the interface through which you can communicate through the kernel. You directly cannot communicate to the kernel. The shell would be like the translator that helps you communicate with the kernel so that the kernel will communicate to the hardware to fulfill your commands or instructions. And fourth would be application and utilities. That is like the tools. This is the outer layer, the part you actually interact with every day. Utility is simple, specialized tools for basic tasks like listing files, ls, copying data, etc. Applications, complex program for end users like web browser, etc. So application and utilities is simply the commands or instructions you provide for getting the needs like applications, utilities, or commands like ls, copying data, cp. So that commands you communicate is known as applications. Need or your instructions that are fulfilled is in the layer application layer. That the commands you put is communicated to the translator, that is shell, and that shell communicates to the kernel. Kernel communicates to the hardware. First would be application, where users gives commands that the kernel understands. In order for the kernel to understand the commands, it needs translator, that is shell. Shell is like the interface that is between your application commands and the kernel. So after you give commands, the shell understands it and the kernel also understands it. Then that kernel communicates that commands or your instructions that it understood to the hardware. So your instructions are fulfilled in these four layers. Component, that is like the hardware. It executes physical tasks like kitchen equipment. Kernel, it manages resources and hardware. It is like the head chef. Shell, it translates user input for kernel. It is like the waiter. Apps or utilities perform specific user tasks, the finished meal. So now what is a Linux distro? Because Linux is like the open source, free for anyone to change. Different groups of people take the Linux kernel and bundle it with different shells and desktop environments to create a finished package. These packages are called distributions or distros. You can think of it like Linux, like it's like the ice cream, and the kernel is the base, milk and sugar, but a distribution is the final flavor like the chocolate, vanilla, or rocky road. They all use the same base, but they look and taste different. So Linux distribution you can understand by knowing that Linux is open source, so it the distributions you see like Ubuntu and everything has a core architecture or core components or core libraries that is Linux. And to make it more efficient, to add more commands and more instructions for users, other companies or other organizations have used that open source Linux to create their own versions or flavors or distributions so users can choose between which they want to prefer. So popular distributions or distros in 2026. It is like the Ubuntu, it is for beginners, it is a standard, it works for most of the users and it is efficient. Linux Mint, it is for Windows features, looks fresh. Fedora for developers, Arch Linux for experts, Zorin OS for modern users. It is extremely beautiful and easy to use. So these are some of the Linux distributions. There are many that is like Kali Linux for cybersecurity and some more as well. Also remember like after today's lecture, you would need to be prepared with your Ubuntu or your WSL to practice the commands, which would be a practical sessions. So I would you can search it up how to set up your WSL or Ubuntu or how to get Linux in your Windows or in your Mac OS. You wouldn't need to do the instance thing for this. You can search up on YouTube. Many videos are available that would help you guide to download or how to use the Ubuntu or Linux in your Windows. So yeah, I hope you would be prepared with those prerequisites for the upcoming lectures. So thanks so much for watching. I hope I made the topic insightful and simple to understand. Have a great day.